If you've been around for long enough in the MHGO community or have looked around in forums and Discord chats a bunch, you've probably seen the age-old question of which skill you should use, weakness exploit or repeat offender. If not, you're probably wondering, why does this even matter? Or why those skills in particular? As we all know, weakness exploit is broken, arguably the best skill in the entire game. But there's a subset of the community that argues that it is beneficial to swap it out for repeat offender instead. Weakness exploit gives you 50% affinity for hitting hit zones of 45 or higher, whereas repeat offender gives you 25 affinity after one attack and then 30 after 4 more hits, which remain for 5 seconds after any hit. This means you effectively get up to 30 affinity from a 10-point skill as long as you keep hitting. That those skills are often compared isn't too surprising. They both cost 10 skill points for a lot of crit, and their conditions are easy to meet. In a crit boost meta, this makes them pretty desirable. Basically, the argument for repeat offender being more useful is that rather than getting 50% affinity on the 45 or higher hit zones, it is more beneficial to just take the 30 affinity anywhere, as it isn't depending on hit zones and people who struggle to consistently hit weak spots benefit more from a flat affinity boost. And to get right to the point, I think this is a terrible argument and I'm going to disprove it in this video using actual numbers to hopefully put a lid on this debate. For one, I think it's silly to call weakness exploit conditional crit and repeat offender not when they are both conditional. And secondly, the people arguing this tend to rely on intuition and ignore a lot of factors that go into the final damage numbers. The problem with that is that the argument appears better than it actually is, due to a warped perception of where the damage comes from. Always 30 is better than sometimes 50 sounds intuitive, but as I will show, the numbers tend to say otherwise. On paper it seems pretty easy to compare weakness exploit versus repeat offender, if we just look at the crit rate. If we assume weakness exploit plus crit boost and repeat offender at full activation plus crit boost are used, we get two multipliers. 1 plus 0.5 times 0.4 equals 1.2 and 1 plus 0.3 times 0.4 equals 1.12. To figure out the hit rate at which weakness exploit becomes better, we form an equation. X is the hit rate on weak spots that we want to figure out, so we multiply it with the wax modifier 1.2 and 1 minus x times 1.0, as these are the remaining hits. Repeat offender always activates, so we get 100% times 1.12, giving us the following equation. Solving by x gives us 60% hit rate, after which weakness exploit becomes better. Which makes sense, because 30% affinity is 60% of 50% affinity. It does seem pretty difficult to reach weak spots this often, doesn't it? But as you might have guessed by the video length and my introduction, it is not quite that simple. There are several factors that people tend to ignore when comparing the skills. First of all, if you want to compare skills, you cannot do that in a vacuum. You have to evaluate the complete set, because some skills affect the values of others. Crit boost, for example, makes affinity boosting skills more valuable, and is itself more valuable the higher your affinity goes. Having more affinity means any additional affinity becomes slightly less valuable too. 10% crit boost affinity is worth 4% from 0 to 10%, but only about 3% from 80 to 90%. Therefore, only if all other skills are included in the comparison can we actually accurately compare the two skills. Furthermore, the sets are also affected by charms and armor piece availability. There are actually better tenderizer charms and better armor pieces with tenderizer on them compared to chain crit. Charms can only get chain crit up to 5 points, whereas tenderizer goes up to 6. Some armor pieces are also just better. The Silver Soul Cap Z, for example, has 3 points in tenderizer, 2 in crit boost, as well as 2 points in spirit and 2 slots. Whereas the Grand Mitsuaoi Kabuto only has 2 chain crit, 3 crit boost, equivalent to the Silos Cap, but no points in spirit and no slots, making it 4 to 5 skill points worse. The Kushala Vice GX has 4 points in chain crit and 1 slot compared to the Genesis Torso XR, which has 5 tenderizer and a slot. Or look at the Genesis Tacit's XR, which has an insane 8 tenderizer and a slot, but no chain crit waste piece that exists gets even close. It is pretty common that a set gets tenderizer from just the 10d6 charm, the soul cap and a slot, whereas Repeat Offender often needs 2 dedicated armor pieces on top of the charm, or a triple slot to activate it. This leads to many sets with tenderizer having lower charm requirements or being able to fit extra skills compared to Repeat Offender sets. It often happens that the comparison isn't just between Repeat Offender and Weakness Exploit, but ends up being between Repeat Offender and Weakness Exploit plus Challenger 1 or Weakness Exploit plus 1 more level crit die. The generic Mantis weapon crit set, for example, fits Challenger 2 into the Tenderizer version, but only Challenger 1 in the Repeat Offender version. The Deora HBG shot booster set cannot fit crit die 2 with Repeat Offender with a 1 skill charm, whereas the Weakness Exploit version can. The Orcus version can get Wax from a Tenderizer 4 or Pierce 3 triple slot charm, but the Repeat Offender version needs a max chain crit 5 triple slot specifically, which is a lot harder to get. From my own charm drops, I estimate getting the Tenderizer or Pierce charm is at least 10 times more likely to drop compared to the plus 5 chain crit charm. The Silver Wind Light Bowgun cannot get a 5th skill at all if it uses Repeat Offender, and needs to downgrade to a Vidya Eye to get crit die, losing 10 raw attack. But it can still fit another skill such as Challenger into the Weakness Exploit version of the set without the slots. To show how this affects the overall Wax threshold, I'm going to compare these weapons. The sets I'm going to assume are the Avidya Eye with Pierce Up, Shot Booster, Crit Boost, Repeat Offender and Crit Die 1, and the Hurricane's Gaze with the same skills except Weakness Exploit over Repeat Offender. The effective raw of the Avidya Eye, assuming Charms, Talents and Attack Food are used with Repeat Offender fully stacked, is 489. Hurricane's Gaze against weak spots is 534 effective raw, and on non-weak spots is 458 effective raw. Now I have the effective raw numbers before multipliers and can plug them into an equation. On the Wax side we have X, which is our hit rate on weak spots, times Wax EFR, plus 1 minus X, which is the rest of the hits that hit something other than weak spots, times non-Wax EFR. On the Repeat Offender side we have 100% times Repeat Offender EFR, because Repeat Offender always activates. Solving by X gives us 41%, which is quite a bit lower than the 60% we had before. However, 41% still doesn't sound too bad for Repeat Offender here. If half the ticks pass into bad hit zones while aiming at weak spots and you miss a little here and there, it's about on par with Weakness Exploit really. Therefore, it should be pretty safe to say it depends on matchup and player skill, and we can conclude that ultimately isn't that big of a deal, right? Wrong. I lied! You've been tricked this whole time. The X in the equation there is not the hit rate. Okay, so now that you feel like an idiot, how about I let you in on what's going on? The equation did in fact solve a rate at which Weakness Exploit becomes better than Repeat Offender. However, I've been ignoring the hit zones the entire time. What we solved for was not the hit rate, it was the damage ratio, which means that Weakness Exploit in this example becomes better if 41% or more of the damage dealt comes from weak spots. But since weak spots are higher hit zones than non-weak spots, they receive more damage from the same amount of hits, meaning that we have to factor that into our equation. The reason I lied to you is because this is a mistake a lot of people make when comparing these skills, and I wanted to retrace this logic to point out its flaw. Whenever you see someone on Reddit, GameFAQs or the build channels and Monster Hunter related Discord servers argue that Repeat Offender is actually 60% as good as Wax, and the hit rate on weak spots has to be really high for Wax to be worth it, they always ignore that you deal way more damage on the zones that proc it. If, for example, a weak spot is 60, but the overall average of the other zones you are hitting is 30, then the weak spot is worth twice as much damage-wise, and you only have to hit it once per 2 hits elsewhere to get half of the quest damage from weak spots. And this affects the balance between Weakness Exploit and Repeat Offender drastically. So much in fact that it's making weakness exploit pretty much always better if you have at least somewhat good access to it. Let's apply that to an example. Let's use the shot zones of Barrioth or Naga, who have a 60 shot head hit zone and a 30 neck hit zone. The new equation looks like this. I multiplied x by the hit zone to separate the hit rate variable from the hit zone variable, plugged in the hit zone and applied the same to the repeat offender side as well. Solving the equation for x gives us... oh. Would you look at that, a complete garbage hit rate. What this means is that in our example, you would only have to hit the weak spot about 1 out of 4 times to outdamage the repeat offender set, which against a monster with even slightly hittable weak spots is pretty easy to do, even if a lot of ticks miss. With that, I have proven that weakness exploit is a lot better even if you are bad at hitting weak spots, assuming these sets and hit zones and assuming repeat offender is always fully stacked. This is exactly why you can't just say repeat offender is more consistent, because it procs everywhere equally. You don't deal the same damage everywhere equally. Hitting weak spots deals more damage than hitting shit zones, thus weakness exploit is disproportionately more rewarded for hitting them. Of course, these sets and hit zones are just examples, but you will find that the general argument and similar hit rates required apply to most monsters in the game if you do the math. Most monsters have at least 1 if not 2 accessible hit zones that tend to be around twice as high as the average of the rest of the hit zones. This goes for pretty much all damage types. If you look at Barrioth, his 60 head hit zone is about double what his other 25 to 40 hit zones are. Cutting even gets a 45 body weak spot to make up for the 5 lower head hit zone. The best wax monsters tend to be walking weak spots such as Rajang or Zinogre, with many hit zones above 45 and some as high as 70. And even the less ideal wax monsters have a pretty good wax zone to compensate, such as Huragan's 55 hit zone compared to his mid-20s hit zones of the rest of his body, or Gravior's 70 chest after break. But I can't actually hit those weak spots, is another argument I hear a lot. But I don't agree with this assessment, because it is typically based on a warp perception. Very few monsters don't have hittable weak spots, and typically, wax uptime from downed monsters tend to be shorter but more valuable than other hit zones, because you can just hit them for free with your best attacks, whereas your uptime is generally bad if you are searching for openings and waiting for the monster to do something. This makes some people believe their wax uptime and damage are worse than they actually are. Take this Rathian for example. Say you don't know how to punish the head properly and go for the 44 leg zones. Pretty good hit zone, just barely not wax territory. I went out of my way to do exactly that and analyze the footage hit by hit. For the sake of the argument, I ignore stray hits in order to not have to factor in the body wax zone. I hit the legs at any opportunity and ignore the head on purpose and only attack it whenever Rathian is down and it is literally completely free. Since I'm hitting the legs, she will trip over occasionally, creating an opening for the 90 head hit zone. In my demo, I even missed a few times due to Joy-Con drift and skill issue, but why not? The more mistakes, the better. The hit ratio in my demo ended up being 34% of free head hits per leg hit. After evaluating the footage and accounting for motion values and repeat offender uptime that I generously rounded up, I still ended up meeting the required hit rate to beat out repeat offender, despite giving repeat offender many unnecessary concessions and an unfair set advantage. You can check the evaluation out for yourself. I left it in the description along with my assumptions and explanation. The uptime perception is also not to be underestimated here. My total time spent actively hitting weak spots in this hunt was 27 seconds out of the 7 minutes 37 seconds I spent hunting her, counting from the second I intend to go for the weak spot to the second I disengage. This means despite the relatively bad uptime, I got more than enough weakness exploit damage for it to beat out repeat offender. It's pretty easy to be misled into thinking it sucked because I only spent 6% of the quest time hitting weak spots, but in the end it was the damage I dealt that mattered. In my demo hunt I would have dealt about 54% of the entire quest damage in those 27 seconds with weakness exploit. It just takes much longer and deals a lot less damage to wait for openings and hit the legs. The relative time you spend hitting each zone isn't what decides if weakness exploit is good. Ultimately, the combination of stronger sets, selectively better hit rates during monster downtimes, and dealing more damage to the hit zones that proc weakness exploit all in combination lead to weakness exploit being much better than it seems on paper if you just looked at the affinity. You could spend 9 minutes of a 10-minute hunt chasing shit zones, but if the 1 minute where the monster is down is spent hitting a weak spot with your best combo, that could still be upwards of half your damage and you wouldn't even notice how much the skill did for you. On top of that, there are some unquantifiable disadvantages that I have not mentioned yet that I will also go over for the sake of completeness. This Rathian hunt, for example, just uses land stash finisher spam for everything. Other weapons could actually gain even more from those openings. Hammer's spinning meteor, for example, can't really be used much unless the monster's down. Longsword can reach the spirit finisher more often. Chargeblade could get a ripper shield out, just to name a few examples. If you hit a monster and it falls over with hammer, even if that takes, say, 3 full combos for a total of 465 motion value, then get Spinning Meteor 3 on the weak spot, which is 260 motion value. That is 35% of your total motion value for this sequence, meaning you met the required Wax threshold to beat out Repeat Offender, and this is not even counting extra hit or the KO you most likely get out of this. The other thing I've been generously assuming in my first example is that Repeat Offender is actually fully stacked the entire time, which more or less means I've been comparing 30 flat crit to weakness exploit, not the actual Repeat Offender effect. While it is an easy condition to meet, it is not guaranteed to have a 100% uptime. Monsters can escape, dig, roar or otherwise waste time, not even counting player mistakes. Let's look at an example to visualize the problem. Let's say we have a quest that takes 100 hits to clear, which is a number I pulled out of my ass, but not unrealistic for an average motion value weapon against G3 monsters. We assume you drop Repeat Offender 4 times. 1 from the Enrage Roar stun, 1 from the monster flying or digging, 1 from the monster leaving the area, and 1 from having to heal or making a mistake otherwise. Plus the start of the quest when it isn't even yet activated. Of those 100 hits, 5 of those have no Repeat Offender effect and another 20 have only 25 affinity. This means on average Repeat Offender actually only reaches 27.5 affinity and not the 30 I have been assuming this whole time. In the Rathian hunt, I realized it is actually incredibly easy for her to just waste 5 seconds anytime and drop it. My average affinity was only about 22%, which is far lower than any estimation I made so far. That being said, some weapons like dual blades and bowguns are less affected by this because they stack it much faster and take many more hits to kill, so it isn't the same for every weapon. I just wanted to mention this so we don't just ignore the condition. With all that in mind, I'm gonna do 2 more exercises to quantify the upper and lower limits of this ratio. For the lower limit, I'm going to compare the Atal crit set and factor in that Repeat Offender drops a few times so that we get 27 affinity on average. The Repeat Offender set has 638 effective raw, and the Weakness Exploit set has 713 effective raw on weak spots, and 610 effective raw everywhere else. I'm assuming Rathian's 90 head and compare it to the average of a non-back, non-stomach hit zones, which is 35, meaning you are gonna hit the neck, wings, tail and legs if you miss. This matchup is very Weakness Exploit favorable because the Repeat Offender set loses a skill, the weak spot is very high compared to the rest of the hit zones, and we penalize the Repeat Offender activation condition. The equation looks like this. This gives us a measly 13% hit rate at which Weakness Exploit becomes better. If you take 100 hits to kill her, that is only 13 hits. You can get that from a mount and a topple alone. For the upper limit, I'm going to assume we have the charms to make Repeat Offender Josina and use Elderfrost dual blades against Redhelm, who has average hit zones of 30 for belly, hind legs and butt, but only 45 on the head. Plus, I'm going to assume the full 30 affinity for the entire hunt. This gives us no set disadvantage and has a relatively bad weak spot compared to the zones that are easy to hit, making this a very Repeat Offender favorable matchup. The Repeat Offender set gets 626 effective raw, the Weakness Exploit set gets 668 effective raw on weak spots, and 562 effective raw on the other hit zones. This gives us a ratio of 50%. This means that even in the absolute most favorable comparison I could come up with, in which I assume no extra skill loss from charms or unavailable armor pieces, perfect repeat offender upkeep and a monster with a low weak spot relative to the more accessible hit zones, I would still only have to hit the weak spot half the time to make the skill equally as good. Now, to be fair, I picked this example because I already know this is a repeat offender matchup. I know weakness exploit is worse in this scenario, but I think it does highlight how weakness exploit can still be a useful damage skill, even if it is at a disadvantage. A trap, para or mount will still give you some decent mileage out of weakness exploit here, even if it loses to repeat offender overall. Now let's talk monsters. Given that most monsters have weak spots that are roughly twice as good as the other zones, or have 2 weak spots out of around 8 different hit zones, and we determined our hit rate requirement to be somewhere between 12 and 50%, but more commonly around 25%, I would go as far as to claim weakness exploit beats repeat offender against most monsters, even if you were hitting them completely at random and disregarded all hit zone knowledge. To support this claim, I sorted all the large monsters in the game by how easy their weak spot is to hit with cutting weapons. Red meaning that they are basically walking weak spots that you cannot possibly miss their weak spots of, such as Rejang. Orange being extremely easy to reach weak spots or multiple accessible weak spots, such as Zinogre. Yellow being somewhere in the middle, which depends on weapon choice and player skill, such as Devil Joe. And green for repeat offender favoring matchups for most weapons such as Red Helm, and monsters that straight up don't have a weak spot, such as Snow Barren. I also purposely overinflated the yellow tier purely because I know someone will argue back about some of these, claiming that they are harder to hit than I think they are. So while I think Amatsu Head, for example, is really easy and free to hit, I put it in yellow regardless, because someone could argue that just standing under him and randomly hitting him everywhere is easier. I don't agree, but I will let it slide for the sake of the argument. By comparison, the list of how easy I think these zones are to hit looks very different, just to give you an idea of how generous I'm being here. The free wax tier, which I argue is so easy to proc wax on that you would have to intentionally miss in order to not get a proc rate of over 50%, consists of 30 monsters, which makes up a third of the large monsters in the entire game. The easy wax tier consists of monsters where I strongly believe wax would beat out repeat offender even if you were ignoring hit zones altogether and just hitting anything in view, because there are several weak spots that tend to present themselves often. This one consists of about a quarter of the roster. The no or no good wax tier consists of monsters where I think repeat offender would always win without specific setups, because the weak spots just aren't very accessible or there straight up aren't any. This is by far the smallest tier, and even within this tier, there's only a single monster with no weak spot at all, Snow Baron Lagombi. The rest of them are in my opinion just unreasonable. For example, Crystalbeard doesn't have a weak spot until the chin break, which requires impact damage. That's not something you can easily do with a cutting weapon. Or Chameleos, who does have a 45 head, but he almost never lowers it, so it's not very accessible for the majority of the hunt. The yellow tier is where I think it depends on weapon choice, skill level and strategy. For example, Silver Rathalos has a good wing hit zone that doesn't proc wax, so if you mainly focus on that instead of breaking the head, weakness exploit isn't worth it. I also included monsters where you need some level of skill. Tigrex, for example, only has one wax zone, and hitting it requires some knowledge of his fight. To be clear, I also think you should bring weakness exploit against these types of monsters most of the time. But the argument is that the hypothetical repeat offender user wouldn't be good enough to hit it often. And I at least want to entertain the argument and not just dismiss it by saying, "Oh, it's not that hard, just get good." I do think you should learn these monsters and use wax on most of them, but that's not what I'm trying to prove. What I'm trying to show here is that even if we entertained the argument that you can't reliably hit weakness exploit on any of these monsters, the added yellow plus green tiers would still only consist of 40 monsters, which is less than half of the monsters in the game. And for yellow specifically, if you recall the weakness exploit ratio examples, I would still believe that even if you aren't good at the game, just from mounts, trips and traps, you can reasonably get enough weakness exploit procs to at least tie the damage of Repeat Offender against most of these. If we assumed you could do this against only half of the yellow tier monsters, you would still end up with a better damage from weakness exploit against 3/4 of the entire monster roster of the game. I even went out of my way to hunt a Tigrex to demonstrate how easy it is to get a good hit rate, by just running towards him and attacking with no regard for openings, and just Valor Sheath spammed my way through the entire hunt. The game plan was just hitting anything in view the moment I could, and it took literally 0 skill and I still ended up hitting the head 41 times out of 100 total hits, which is well above the wax requirement. This is a monster I put in the yellow tier, by the way. If I had charged my GS whenever he turned, which is a really easy opening to exploit, I probably would have done upwards of 70% of the quest damage on the weak spot, just by running towards him and using the most basic head turn strat. This is not hard to do and anyone can learn it within a few hunts. And finally, to address the final potential counter argument. But both are good, so what if Repeat Offender loses slightly? It's not like it is wasted and you don't lose that much. Fair enough. That might be right, but the reasoning goes both ways. Even if you are fighting bad weakness exploit matchups, it's not like missing the weakness exploit damage is gonna failure the quest, even if you never proc it. And secondly, if we argue about how slim the disadvantage is, I can flip this around. I could say that if you have a monster that requires 20 wax procs to beat Repeat Offender, and you only hit 10 of them, the skill is also just marginally worse and not completely wasted. It's the same argument, except I would have to leverage this against those 40 yellow and green tier monsters, but the Repeat Offender only marginally loses argument has to count for the 75 red, orange and yellow ones, which means weakness exploit would still be at an advantage. Why not just use the one that is better against more monsters? Personally, I would rather lose 30% crit on the bad hit zones against the minority of the roster than losing 20% crit on the best hit zones against the majority of the roster. I would also rather let the skill go to waste against those 6 monsters without good wax spots, rather than not have wax against the other 87. Regardless of how you frame it, weakness exploit just wins or ties against the large majority of the roster, which makes it simply the better skill overall. Now that I have done all I can to debunk the myth that Repeat Offender beats out weakness exploit in a lot of matchups, I want to bring up some actually good reasons why you would want to substitute weakness exploit with Repeat Offender. Starting by acknowledging that some monsters simply don't have good weak spots, and in those cases you would just have to use it if you didn't want to waste the skill points. Snow Baron would be the prime example because he just doesn't have any 45 hit zones for cutting. In cases like that, Repeat Offender would just be better and you should use it. In some other cases, you would actually still want to use it, even if there is a weak spot, if a non-weak spot is simply way more accessible and is relatively high. Good examples of this are non-Hyper Silver Rathalos, who has a 44 wing zone that is easy to hit, and Gammoth Gunner matchup, where it is actually better to just shoot the 40 head for better uptime and more pierce ticks compared to the trunk, which is a conditional, hard to reach weak spot and is generally not worth chasing after because it isn't even that much higher anyway at just 45. And finally, sometimes it's best to focus on primary elemental weaknesses over raw damage. Savage Joe, for example, has high raw weak spots, but the Enraged head has a 0 elemental weakness and is very hard to reach with some weapons, making it better for slow, raw favoring weapons like Greatsword to snipe the head and chest, but faster elemental favoring weapons like dual blades are better off just going for the easy to reach legs and hitting on the high thunder weakness instead. This is all very matchup dependent, however, and mainly affects a small portion of the yellow tier monsters, and not the majority of the roster. And that's all I have on this topic. Hopefully this covers all there is to say about it and convinces some people to not blindly follow bad advice from people on Reddit who did no research and ran 0 numbers. Intuition is often wrong, the numbers usually aren't. TLDR, weakness exploit good, please use it. Don't ditch it for Repeat Offender thinking it's more consistent unless you actually run the numbers. It's usually not worth it, as I have just shown.